Chapter 4 of A Lucky Penny by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, in which Tom escorts Miss Fanny Wickes to the matinee. By the end of the week, Tom Garland had made considerable progress as a compositor, and had been commended both by the foreman and Mr. Wickes himself. This was something unusual, and was duly commented on by the other boys, who had no remembrance of having received anything but sarcasm or abuse from the boss of the establishment or from Runyon. Miss Fanny Wickes also visited the printing office one afternoon, which she did not often do, and hung around the neighborhood of Tom's frame for a good half-hour. But a great surprise was in store for Garland. When the boys quit work Saturday noon for dinner, Runyon stopped Tom and told him to report into Mr. Wickes' office, across the entry from the printery, at 1 o'clock, which was the hour when work was resumed. Of course he did so. Bentley Wickes was writing a ponderous editorial on the duty of the Christian to the heathen. Master Garland, you have read the regulations of this establishment over carefully, have you? Yes, sir, replied the boy, wondering what was coming. Then you will remember that Rule 12 says that when a member of my family desires the services of one of the inmates of his establishment, he is expected to obey all orders coming from that person. Yes, sir. Very well. Go upstairs, put on your best clothes, and then report to my daughter Fanny in the parlor. Tom withdrew. I wonder what that prize package wants with me, he said to himself with a grimace as he slowly took his way to the garret to change his clothes and brush his hair. Miss Fanny, dressed in her most gorgeous finery and prepared to go out, was awaiting him in the parlor. She smiled sweetly, or at least that is what she meant her features to express when Tom appeared hat in hand. "You are Tom Garland?" she said coquettishly. "Yes, Miss Wickes." "You may call me Miss Fanny, if you like," she said, screwing her countenance into another smile. Tom bowed politely. "I am going to the matinee this afternoon," she continued, "and I require an escort. I asked my father to assign you to that duty." Garland was so surprised that he nearly dropped. "I may say that this is the first time a boy has been permitted to go outside the bounds, but Pa never refuses me anything." "It is certainly a great privilege to accompany the charming daughter of the proprietor of this establishment to the matinee or elsewhere," replied Tom, hiding a grin behind his hand as he bowed low to Miss Wickes. Miss Fanny giggled and tried to look archly at the good-looking boy who had taken her fancy. "Isn't he polite?" she said to herself. Then aloud she said, "We will go now." The watchman unlocked the side gate and let them out into the street. He didn't say anything, of course, but he looked surprised to see one of the inmates permitted to go at large, as it were. "He's just too handsome for anything," thought the girl, casting a side glance at her manly young escort as they walked down the street. She hoped that her bosom friend, Carrie Bird, would be looking out of her window as they passed their house. As it happened, Miss Bird was looking out of the window, and as Miss Bird had insinuated on more than one occasion that Fanny couldn't catch a beau to save her life, Miss Wickes nodded and smiled triumphantly as she passed, and of course her dear friend Carrie was very much astonished at what she saw. They took an electric car at the next corner and rode down to the vicinity of the tunnel. The theater for which Miss Fanny had tickets was at the corner of Maverick and Frankfort Streets. They entered the theater and were shown to good seats in the orchestra. Tom only had a quarter in his clothes, but he thought he would invest this to his advantage. So at the close of the first act he excused himself, went outside and purchased a box of mixed candies, which he presented to Miss Fanny on his return inside. "Aren't you just too kind?" she said, beaming all over her freckles as she accepted the present. "Might as well make myself solid while I'm about it," Tom thought as he grinned at her cheerfully. "Isn't the play delightful?" she said later when the leading soubrette waltzed on and sang a popular melody in ragtime. "Yes," replied Tom. "It is quite on the blink." Fanny seemed a bit puzzled by his remark, but didn't like to ask him what he meant. She presumed it was something complimentary to the show. Garland, who had been accustomed to attend the theater quite often, thought the performance rather rocky. "How do you like the industrial farm?" asked Fanny curiously during the next intermission. "I'd like it better if we had more to eat," he replied bluntly. "Don't you really get enough?" she inquired in apparent surprise. "Not according to my standard, Miss Fanny, but I guess I can stand it if others can." "Well, "You're going to dine with us this evening," she said sweetly. "That isn't according to the regulations, is it?" "We sometimes make exceptions where we especially like a boy," she answered in a tone that meant to convey the impression that "we" meant herself. Tom grinned without making a reply. "If you want a favor at any time, all you've got to do is ask me, and I'll see that you get it," she added. "Thanks. You're awfully good." Then the curtain went up on the last act. It was a restaurant scene. By and by the chief comedian came out, sat down to a table, and ordered a meal. It was duly brought by a comic servant. The comedian wrestled a while with the contents of his plate. Then he shouted to the waiter, "Look here, this steak is like leather. Take it away." "Can't change it now, sir," grinned the waiter. "You've bent it." "Wasn't that funny?" giggled Fanny as the audience roared at the joke. "Awfully," chuckled Tom. "That waiter is bent on saying something amusing." "Aren't you just too delightfully clever?" cried the girl, slapping him playfully in the arm with her fan. "I was born so," replied Tom solemnly. "You must excuse me." "What a ridiculous fib." Just then the comedian threw the steak at the waiter and knocked him down, whereat everybody laughed again, Miss Fanny fairly shrieking with delight. "Do you know, I should like to go on the stage myself," said Miss Wickes when she had recovered her breath. "I think you'd make a hit," remarked Garland with a grin. "Do you really?" she said delightedly. "Sure thing. You'd be the whole show." He meant holy show, but he didn't say it, of course. "I'm going to ask Pa to let me," she said, as if suddenly impressed with the idea of her histrionic ability. "I wouldn't ask him all at once," said Tom. "It might stagger him. Do it by installments." And then the curtain came down, and they took their departure for the farm. "Remain here in the parlor till I come down," said Miss Fanny after they entered the house. "I'll play something for you on the piano, and by that time dinner will be ready." "I'll have my first square meal this week," muttered Garland as he wandered over behind the thick curtains which shaded the parlor windows. "It's worth it to be seen with that girl at a show," which we are sorry to say was not at all complimentary to the peculiar charms of Miss Fanny. Tom could see the cottages which lined the opposite side of the street where he stood. The gate which afforded entrance to the establishment was also right in front of him, a few yards away, and beside it the watchman's lodge. The space between the house and the front wall was laid out as a garden, and the boy saw his little lame chum Dick Rogers weeding the ground. "Poor fellow," mused Tom sympathetically. "He has a hard time of it here." Then his attention was directed to the gate by the clang of the bell. In a moment or two the watchman made his appearance at the door of the lodge, walked to the barrel gate, and, pushing aside a small panel, interviewed the visitor. The gatekeeper seemed to be satisfied with the character of the caller, for he unbarred the gate and admitted him. "Great shakes!" exclaimed Tom in astonishment. "It's my uncle, Mr. Sleek." End of chapter 4.